So as you can see on the bench today, I have an Amiga A500 motherboard. I briefly used an Amiga 500, not really sure, late 80s, early 90s maybe. I had ended up with an Atari ST and had a family member with an Amiga, and I got to just play with it very briefly. I've always been very intrigued with the Amiga, the hardware and the custom chips and everything. This one came my way. The PCB looks, pretty clean overall. Front and back, I didn't see any damage in the photos. So pretty happy overall with it. I have no idea if it works. It wasn't sold as working. It probably doesn't, but one never knows. I've been doing kind of a visual look over, and one of the things I noticed is this capacitor right here rocks very easily back and forth, and that can be a sign of damage inside of the cap, etc. But in rocking it, hopefully this will show up. I don't know if you can see, the one solder joint here is completely cold. Actually, they're both cold solder joints, and that solder joint is just rocking away there. It looks to me like potentially both these caps have been replaced by somebody at some point. So I'm going to go ahead and pull them both out before I even apply power. I don't have an Amiga power supply. I think what I'm going to do is probably just solder leads directly on the backside here and use a bench power supply to power the system up. I've looked briefly through what technical references I can find, enough to know this is composite out over on this end. I have no reasons to believe that without a keyboard connected it won't come up, although time will tell. I can see some evidence here of kind of some nasty rework or just poor soldering at the factory. But overall it's pretty clean. I've taken a quick look at all of the small electrolytics, and they're probably all dried out and failing. Honestly, it could probably be recapped. I should just order a A500 recap kit. Spent a fair amount of time looking at systems on eBay, etc., just kind of wanting to have a play with it, but this just seemed kind of like an interesting way to jump in. Get the soldering pencil heated up here. I don't even know if these two caps are in the correct orientation. I'm a little bit confused looking at these, in that there seems to be a cross-hatched, maybe ground area here. I don't know if a pad's been lifted there. That may be damage that happened when this was shipped to me. That would be a high point on the board if it took a hard thump and pushed through. Again, I just don't know, honestly, but before I do anything really applying power, I really want to do a thorough look over. I did print out pinouts for the power connector, both the female on the PCB and the male. I actually have one of these connectors on order. Found it on eBay fairly inexpensively. Much more inexpensive than power supplies, and it looks like almost all the power supplies on eBay are, of course, European. It's a very popular machine in Europe. So if I could actually find a pencil here, I would make a couple notes. But as always, the stuff in the lab is 3 feet deep. Projects on top of projects. Don't know if those are better glasses or not. As always, I'm struggling for my good glasses, as I always do when you've got as many pairs floating around as I do. Here's my good up close pair. There's my pencil. So I'm just going to make a quick drawing here. video output. I've got some kind of DB connector off to something here, and what I really want to capture is the two electrolytics. They're sitting here like this, and this has got the negative end to this side and the negative end to this side. This is probably in the silk screen, but again, better safe than sorry. I think for both of these, I'm just going to heat the pins and rock them out rather than try to get in there and actually desolder. I may need a somewhat larger tip here. I am dealing with, I believe, a ground plane. Really confused what I'm seeing there. That pin certainly wasn't soldered in. Somebody using an inadequate tool, perhaps to try to replace these to repair it. Of course, I got to be careful not to pull a trace off the back or the front side of the board in doing this. Well, he came out just fine and dandy. The other one is from here. This is to here, and he dropped right out. These are 3300 microfarad, 16 volt. It's actually a 105 degree C cap, so it's quote a little better high quality cap, although I don't recognize JackCon at all as a name for electrolytic caps. There's actually quite a mess on this side now that I look at it. Oh, there's been lifted traces, it looks like, and somebody's done some rework that looks really ugly. Yeah, I see what's happened here. Potentially, wow, that's really ugly. See, I'm getting this somewhat in frame. There's a jumper wire coming off here that comes around to this resistor that appears to be replacing perhaps a blown out trace there. The pads on this side look okay, they just need to be cleaned out, but that is an ugly rework. Those are just floating. It's not soldered over to the resistor here at all. And that I'm not sure what I'm seeing there. Is that trace lifted? Yeah, that trace is lifted. So that is replacing a pretty heavy trace on the board, but that trace doesn't seem to go to this plus pad here. And I'm not sure where that pad's supposed to connect. I'm going to lift that jumper wire out of there just so I can get a better look underneath at the traces. I may have to go find that was an interesting noise. I may have to go find a board layout diagram to understand what's actually going on under here. As always, the tool I want isn't laying here, even though I just spotted it 30 seconds ago. Oh, it's always the way it is. So let me get a look in here at what we have. There is a trace here that is completely lifted off the board that obviously ran to this resistor. So that needs to be reworked. There is no copper left that I can see in that hole. That's been very poorly done. I'm sure this is probably just input filtering based on the size of the traces. Oh, that's tragic. Somebody lifted that. The question is was this supposed to come to this hole right here? And I suspect it was. There's a cross-hatched, what seems to be a ground there, which would have been to the negative side of the capacitor. This trace runs up and around, and I see no evidence that come through to this hole. I can't tell if that hole is part of this. Really hard looking at that to tell. I'm going to have to get online and see if I can find some close-up photos or dig up the schematic for this area here. You know, there's some ugly soldering done over here. I'm sure these are decoupling caps. I don't know what somebody did there. You know, one of the reasons I grabbed this board is it does have all the chips in it, which was, you know, nice. With the better glasses on here, I'm just looking for evidence of an actual failure under any of these caps. You know, a little spot of wet underneath them. The electrolytic may have leaked out, although as I said, those seem to be most likely original. Again, I'm not seeing evidence like on these two here of rework on the back side of the board. There's not extra flux floating around. And I take that back. This guy right here has been reworked. What has somebody done there? No, that's interesting. So there's potentially a cold solder joint right there. It doesn't move, but somebody's done something really ugly there. There's just a ball of solder sitting there where they're potentially a cold joint, or even worse, it's just a ball of solder on the resistor lead. There's definitely been some rework done right here, and that's on this cap, and that's a pretty ugly job there as well. So somebody's had to go with this board. I'm sure using a cheap soldering pencil. Perhaps lack of experience with rework, though we kind of all get there. Yeah, this guy's been replaced. This guy's been replaced. This guy has potentially been replaced. Again, I don't know if you can see all the flux and the really poor soldering again. Somebody didn't have enough thermal capacity in the soldering pencil to heat up the ground side, and they've ended up with these large balls of solder. Yep, he's been reworked. He's been replaced. There's flux on the board. Somebody's done something ugly here. At least there seems to be, probably off frame here, seems to be flux in here. potentially cold solder joint there. None of these are great on the power connector. Don't know, I'm glad I didn't just throw power on here and pray. I am guessing somebody's had a go at this in an attempt to recap at least parts of it, either to try to fix it or just because they thought recapping would be a good idea and perhaps took it out at that point. And I'm just trying to look at every solder joint. You know, having worked on it, I'm now comparing pin 1 to all the notches on all the ICs to make sure a chip hasn't put back in backwards, and it doesn't look like it has. The Fat Angus looks kind of odd in the socket. Although it's probably fine. That's a little... It's not as centered in the socket as I believe it should be. The problem is I'm not seeing a notch up high in the plastic. It may be down a little further. That would indicate he's in correctly. That's something we'll look at in more detail. This hybrid, I'm sure it says video output underneath, so I'm sure it's part of getting the composite video out. I have no idea if this thing outputs PAL or NTSC. My composite monitors are all NTSC, but if we get video out, even if it won't sync, we'll at least know there's enough functionality for the board to try to run. I'm hoping to actually get some kind of picture of, you know, the insert floppy screen on the Amiga. But I can certainly see there's some stuff I need to go research. Some stuff I certainly need to clean up. I find these little pieces of clear tape, like over these two resistor leads. I'm assuming to keep a capacitor from shorting up against them. Interesting. That needs to be repaired. And it must have gone to that pin. I don't see it going anyplace else. So I got to think about the best way to get that put back together. Again, I'll dig out the schematic and look at C402 and 403. That's just rather poor rework. If you're going to dive into a recap on any vintage computer and you haven't spent time with a soldering pencil in a rework, I highly recommend you dig up some scrap PCBs and just have a play at getting components off and back on and get comfortable with it. And, you know, especially find things with large ground planes and spend some time to understand how to get that ground plane heated up so the solder melts all the way through the via. This to me, look at the wrong part of the board. This to me, where this trace is lifted, is my guess is somebody did what I did a little while ago, and that is heated a pin and tried to rock the device off, and the solder had not melted all the way through to the top of the board and ended up lifting the traces. You know, you can get a feel as you're heating things whether the solder is released or not. It just takes a bit of practice and time. But no, this wasn't damaged in shipping. That was definitely just somebody's attempt at a kludge, and repairing that's going to be interesting. I got to think about how I'm going to put that back together. You know, there's a spiking cap hooked to that ferrite bead, which is why there's that bit of solder up there. You know, overall the board's not in horrible shape. It shows some clumsy rework. Can't really fault somebody for wanting to get their machine working. Well, I think I'll stop recording at this point, and I'll go off and do more research now that I've kind of zeroed down on some areas that I need to worry about, and I'll come back when I have something more to share.